right, can we stand again? We continue our praise time. Sounds like you said Brother Gilmore would be here 4 days and the other speaker for 4 days. So then Brian owes us 3 more days, if that's the minimum. All right? Okay. All right. Huh? What are you asking?
So our next song is going to be Psalm 18, and this one is kind of around for the verse part. So if we can have this side of the room, we're going to be the echo with me and Leah, and in parentheses, and then that side of the room will sing with these ladies, not in parentheses. So you'll be singing first.
The louder, the better. We need your help here.
Who is say this because I get a lot of people that will, especially missionaries, excited to come and preach to you guys and teach you guys. And it's not that I don't trust him, but when he said he was excited, I really believe him. He's really excited to come here. That's the impression I got. I'm excited to have him here, and come on up and maybe you can excite some of us old folks around.
Oh, thanks, Dad.
Thank you.
Good morning. Am I coming through? Great. Turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. And while you open there, I do want to say I'm very excited to be here. It's great to be back. We always get such a warm welcome, and it's just great. So thank you for having us. This morning's message is on leprosy. I've titled it simply that, leprosy. And I want to give some context to the story that we're about to read. The year is 930 BC. King Solomon has died, and the kingdom of Israel is divided in a fierce power struggle. The northern and southern kingdoms have both turned to wickedness, and a succession of prophets arise to call their people back to God. 55 years have passed now, and a fiery young prophet begins his ministry, proclaiming the power of God boldly in the face of intense persecution. His name is Elijah. And in the course of his ministry, he befriends a fellow prophet named Elisha, who is with him until his last days. The division of the kingdom has left Israel and Judah vulnerable to their foreign neighbors. Syria, Israel's northern neighbor, is particularly troublesome and is doing frequent raids into the northern kingdom, almost like an older sibling trying to provoke a younger sibling to wrath. And these raids have weakened the already fragile morale of the people of Israel. And so with that short introduction, we descend into this story of a man named Naaman. And I just want to say 2 Kings, if you're not familiar, it's about here in the Bible. And I say that because I sometimes have to remember myself where it is. 2 Kings, and we're going to read just the first verse. It says, "Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man." Again, Syria was the northern kingdom's rival and enemy. Naaman was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor. But he was a leper. I want to read that one more time. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. And he was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. I want to speak briefly on leprosy to give you a context for what Naaman is dealing with. Leprosy is actually one of the oldest diseases that we have fossil record of, which is fascinating. It's a bacteria. It's mentioned over 60 times in the Bible, the majority of which, what's surprising to me, is actually in the New Testament. Sometimes a broader term for disease, for this disease is rot in the Bible, or mold. Sometimes it's said that there's rot and mold in the houses. But it afflicted people up to our current age, this bacteria. The man with the withered hand whom Jesus restores in Mark chapter 6 is believed to have been suffering from leprosy. It's a bacteria that ravages the skin, nerves, and eyes. And if you look at pictures of leprosy and a leper, you'll often see them with their extremities, their hands and their feet, rotting away or slowly just withering away. Withering is actually a very powerful example of it. And for many years, for centuries, it was believed that the bacteria itself was causing the body to deteriorate, to disintegrate in many ways. And it wasn't until the 1940s that a doctor named Dr. Paul Brand, which may be a familiar name, he was a noted leprosy physicist. He made a very important discovery. He realized that it wasn't the bacteria that was causing the people's hands to wither. It was the fact that because leprosy was causing the nerves in their arms and legs to become so thick that they've actually lost feelings in the tips of their fingers. And that was bad when you're living out, especially when you're living outside or in shallow shelters, because rodents could come and be gnawing at your fingers and you don't even feel it. Imagine that you're so numb in your body that you don't feel pain of something eating away at you. And same with feet. I I think of the example of when you touch a hot pan, you immediately recoil your hand because it's a rocket up to your brain saying there's danger. But those who have leprosy don't have that gift. And that is why Dr. Paul Brand, in his famous work on lepers, said the greatest gift he can actually give his patients was pain. Isn't that fascinating? It almost seems, especially in our Western society, I hate to say that, but we like to avoid pain. Do this, take this, run from this, do this, to avoid facing our pain. But yet, Dr. Brand says pain is actually the gift I would love to give my patients to actually help them through. And here we have a man who has accomplished much. If I was to read his resume, and if I owned a business that needed someone like him, I would say he's hired on the spot. It said he was mighty man. He was well respected by all his peers, right? It even said he was used by the Lord. He was a mighty man of valor. He had an excellent resume. The way I look at this verse is like stacked upon stacked. You can't say much better about him. He's a powerful, wise, honorable man. But at the end of the verse, something cuts through like an interruption to all of his accomplishments. And it was something he couldn't control. He was a leper. And I was thinking this through, how if I was him, if I was Naaman, how I would feel. And I would feel that I could fight better, and I could think smarter, and I could lead my people more courageously, and I could listen more carefully to people to figure out how to solve problems, but I could not heal harder. And for someone who's such an achiever as Naaman must have been, it must have been very hard to realize, I can't solve this. I can't get through this on my own. It's something that's outside of my control. So, as we move through the rest of this chapter and this story of Naaman, I want you to focus on leprosy. And I don't mean the disease. By leprosy this morning, I want you to think about that one thing, or at least one thing in your life, over which you have no control, but which may cause you to feel shame or cause you to recoil from the grace of God. Because that's what leprosy did in the physical sense. It caused intense social shame. In fact, in the law, it says to put them outside the camp until they were healed. There is intense shame with leprosy. There's this loneliness that comes from it, and there's that inability to feel because of the thickened nerves. So I want you to pause for a moment and think about, what is leprosy in your life? Now, I have some examples to help you think this through so that this story becomes more impactful. It could be a disease. It could be something in your life of which you're ashamed, perhaps that, I know if a terminal diagnosis, perhaps, something that's causing you to make it hard to feel the grace of God in your life. It could be a very difficult personal circumstance that you're going through. And I was debating whether to share this, but I'm going to share with you my leprosy, and hopefully it helps you. My leprosy is actually my mental health. And I didn't realize this until I got older, and especially until recently, that I suffer from anxiety. And not just, oh, I'm nervous about this, but this overwhelming touch where if something triggers, I get a flood of thoughts that overwhelm me. And that may not sound like it's sin, and I want to point that out, that your leprosy that you identify may not be a sin, but it may cause you to sin. It may cause you to withdraw from the grace of God. I'll share with you that my anxiety, when I'm in those spells of anxiety and it's overwhelming, that I can be very unkind to my wife and short with my kids. So although my anxiety is not my sin, my response to it could lead me to become a jerk or to be rude. What is your leprosy? What is that thing in your life that causes you shame or dishonor and causes you to not feel the presence and grace of God? And this morning, we're going to look at 4 errors in our understanding of suffering, of this concept of leprosy. And the first error that I often run into, and perhaps you as well, is that I see my leprosy, I see my anxiety as an interruption in my life. That everything's going well, everything's good, and then bam, something strikes, and it's over which I have no control. And I want to say, with my particular one, if I'm quiet and I spend time in the grace of God, I feel it lift, and I feel that peace that passes all understanding. And then I get up and I start my day, and something triggers it, and whoosh, the flood is back. So your leprosy, you can have moments of victory, but it's that recurring issue that you have to deal with over and over again. And here, Naaman was likely thinking, I could have been king. I have such a great resume, and I'm so well regarded by everyone around me, but I have this one thing over which I have no control. I would be furious if I was him. I would be furious. I would look at my circumstances and say, this is entirely and completely unfair. This is a grave interruption to what I thought my life was going to be. But the most important thing that we can learn from the Bible and from the stories of story after story in the Bible is that if we devalue our leprosy, our suffering as merely an interruption, we miss an opportunity to be refined by it. And I don't mean to sound overly super spiritual, but it's true. If we devalue and look at whatever it is, for Naaman it was his leprosy, and if he just saw that as a big chunk, a big gash in the beauty and perfection of his life that he had built, and he merely saw it as an interruption over which he had no control, he can fall into deep despair. And I believe he was about to. I believe he was about to. There are many ways that you can respond to your leprosy, but if you frame it merely as an interruption, there are few ways to respond well. And I think one of the reasons that I view my own suffering and own leprosy in my life as an interruption is because I feel like I have too much control over my life. And I was trying to think of an illustration about this, and I picture it like an Etch-a-Sketch, that I'm turning the dials just right to make a beautiful picture. Actually, I'm really terrible at an Etch-a-Sketch. I don't know if you guys, but I'm always like, it always gets squiggles. And then it's coming out just right. I'm controlling it just enough. And then bam, someone knocks into my arm and I lose my picture. And I feel like that's how suffering can invade our life. Sometimes we feel fine and suddenly we walk into a diagnosis we were not expecting. Or we feel a pain that we're like, something's different. Something's happening. Or we find ourselves in a life circumstance, perhaps we lose our job, or a financial situation that we become shameful of, and it makes it hard to feel the grace of God. But the problem, or one of the problems that I know I have, is I feel I have way too much control over my life. And sometimes that's what helps me realize my place before an almighty God. So now, how do we move past this first error? What can we do to help us move past this first error? And I think some clues are in the verses that follow. So 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 2, it says, And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. So I was thinking about this little maid, this little girl, who had this beautiful moment of insight to realize, I know someone who can solve my master's issue. It's powerful. But I want you to think for a moment. She had a life of freedom, probably only a year or two before this, and then she was captured, brought from her home, and made basically a captured slave for Naaman. That new identity was likely a very shameful form of leprosy for her. It wasn't necessarily the disease, but it was her new identity. Just like Naaman's he was known as a leper. Hers was now as a captured slave. But you know what she didn't do, which I'm guilty of? She didn't forget the goodness and the power of her God. And that's powerful. And I think one of the clues, and I was trying to think, how could I not forget, in the face of my own struggles and suffering, the goodness of God? And I think Paul gives us a clue in several of his letters where he's like, pursue righteousness, but in particular, keep a clear conscience. And it seems like a play on words or just a small change in words, but I think when we enter in those moments of suffering over which we have no control, those moments when our new identity is suddenly leprous, that when we enter it with a clear conscience, Paul is right. We can be victorious through it, or at least better so. And we have more tools and more health to move through those times. I remembered a story that this woman in our Sunday school back probably 10 years ago told the story because I was teaching a lesson on having a clear conscience. And she said, just this week, she had popped a tire. She blew a tire on I-95. She was going to work, and it was in the morning, rush hour, and the tire blew, and she had to pull over to the side of the road. And she's like, and I was late for work, and I was thinking of all this thing. And she's like, she began to reflect on the presence of God in that moment. And she realized that she said, I can't define it, but I just had this clear conscience that I wasn't being punished, if that makes sense. And she said, because I had this clear conscience before God, and she's like, I'm not perfect, but I had a clear conscience that when the tow truck driver came, even though I was in a moment that should have been very stressful, I had the presence of mind to share the gospel with him. And I love that. And here's this captured slave, her new identity, her old life, her old friends likely, wiped away in a flash. And yet she could come and say, I know someone who can help you. It's powerful. And the second way, let's keep reading, verse 5. It says, and the king of Syria said, go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 pieces of gold and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes, and said, am I God, to kill and make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. So whereas the captured slave could have been bitter and grown numb to the presence of God, she remembered his goodness. But here the king of Israel, who should know very clearly the story and the history of how God carried Israel out of Egypt and parted the seas and brought them through incredible miracles, and yet he could say, what am I supposed to do here? This was obviously very much an interruption in the king of Israel's life. It was a great interruption to suddenly realize he has to solve an issue. They must be starting a fight. That's an interruption. And instead of thinking about how to solve it through the power of God, he instead says, what am I supposed to do? Am I God? So I think the second clue to us not framing our suffering or our leprosy as an interruption is to have an intentional awareness of God's presence. An intentional awareness of God's presence. I think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's not their real names. Those were the names that were given to them by their captors, by the people who captured them. And Daniel, too, was given a new name. I should have wrote it down. So, yep, very good. Paul, I think of all these people who were given a new identity, and in the face of their suffering, they remembered the goodness and the power of God. And their lives, there are new identities under these people that took over them and gave them these names that were not honoring to God, should have been their leprosy, and yet they still saw the power of God working in their midst. So we'll see Naaman make several errors in his understanding of suffering, but I think the first error that we make is to think that our suffering, that our leprosy is merely an interruption. The second error, let's keep reading verse 8 through 11. It says, and it was so, when Elisha, the man of God, had heard the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth and went away and said, behold, listen to what he says, behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. He was wroth. He was upset. He thought that God was going to make up for his suffering. Think about what he's saying. I was expecting a show. I'm being asked to bathe in a filthy river. I am leprous. I am covered in leprosy. I am a mighty man of valor who is now, my dignity is completely destroyed. And you're asking me to go bathe in a filthy river on top of it. And he says, I thought God was going to do something greater. So the second error that Naaman is making, and that I know myself I often make, is the feeling that God needs to justify himself for my ills. I feel like when I go through suffering or there's a big interruption, the big shake of the Etch-a-Sketch, that I feel like someone owes me, that God owes me for this, that what I'm going through, whatever it is. And sometimes I think, although I may not say the words, I can have this heart when it doesn't go well. I could think, God, I thought you were going to do something miraculous. I thought you were going to do something miraculous. That's what Naaman's saying here. And I want to share with you, several years ago, a friend of ours got diagnosed with an illness, and me and my wife were praying very deeply for her, and very deeply with this sense that God will heal her. And we just felt like there's so much around this that God could show himself. And the disease progressed, and she passed away. And then I remember as we were driving to the funeral and the days before, I'm like, okay, God, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do to make up for this? I'm so excited. I'm so excited to see you decided to let this woman pass. I don't understand why you did that. She had a young family. So I'm ready to see you move. I'm ready. And I remember sitting in that funeral, and it was a beautiful celebration of this woman's life. And the message was great. And we all stood up, and then we had food, and we left the church and continued on with our lives. And I remember distinctly getting my things from the pews of the church and feeling stood up. I expected a revival. This may sound corny, but it was such a blow that I thought God would give an angel. I thought I'd see something. It didn't make sense why he would allow this suffering to take place in the life of this woman who was godly, and the life of her family who was godly, and remove her from it. It didn't make sense. And I felt like God blew the equation. I'm on odd ground here by saying that, so I have to be careful, but I felt like I was expecting God to do something, and he did not. And I think Naaman here is thinking, I've suffered enough, haven't I? And you're asking me to remove even more of my dignity in front of my closest men? I thought you were going to do something miraculous. And it wasn't until I read a book, and this is the second time I mentioned him, but he's very powerful in my life. Timothy Keller, he has a book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And in that book, he tells the story of Elizabeth Elliot. And you're probably very familiar with the story, but Elizabeth's husband, Jim, and 4 of his friends were ambushed and killed by the very tribe that they were going to reach. And in the years that followed, Elizabeth, the wife, struggled with the sense that God must somehow make up for the lives that had been lost. And she shared this to Tim Keller and his wife, Kathy. Because 4 men died, her logic went, means X number of Warani tribesmen must get saved, right? That their lives, the 4 lives of her husband and her friends, the 5 lives, or 4 men rather, that somehow God needs to make up for that wrong that she saw. And when I was reading this book, I knew that equation. It made sense to me. That feeling of like, God, you've allowed this to happen. You didn't intervene in the way that I thought you would. So what are you going to do now? Naaman has this same issue, this equation that we're trying to balance. It's the equation where God justifies his actions and squares all injustices. It's the very same question that had failed in the face of our friend's death and funeral. And as I read Elizabeth Elliot's story, I became distinctly aware that I was in deep bondage to this sense that God needs to justify himself in all of my situations. But it was her remedy that spoke life to me. And she continues on. She said, God, if he was merely my accomplice, had betrayed me. God, in some ways, had allowed her best friend to be taken from her. He had betrayed her if he was merely her accomplice. But if, on the other hand, he was God, he had freed me. He had freed me. Yearning to make the equation balance in each and every life circumstance is exhausting. And I equate it to this, that when we're looking for God to make up for something that we perceive as unjust or not fair, that we are not walking by faith, but rather we're working for sight. That's how I feel. I feel like I need to see you move, God. I used the example that I felt stood up as I was leaving that funeral service, that it's not walking by faith in God, it's working for sight. And that's not an easy thing to give up. because it's far easier to believe and worship something that you feel like you can see rather than just having faith in someone that you feel that you cannot see. But I want to share that Habakkuk struggled with the same thing. So about 100 years after this story of Naaman, Israel had fallen even deeper into its ways, and God has now sent a army to go and basically punish Israel for their sin, or he allows them, he lifts his hand of protection, and these armies come in. And Habakkuk asked God, he's like, why is there so much suffering? Why is there so much evil? Why are you allowing this to happen? And God's answer is, well, the armies that are coming to invade you will also be punished, and they will experience suffering. And Habakkuk, if I put myself in Habakkuk's shoes, I likely picture him pausing for a moment, and he's very respectful to God when he asks this next question. He says, I'm paraphrasing, I still don't understand why we're suffering, though. And God then, in Habakkuk 2, brings Habakkuk through this sweeping narrative of who God is and his wondrous ways. But it's what he ends with that's very powerful. It says at the very end of Habakkuk 2, this is the Lord speaking, what profiteth the graven image that the maker thereof hath graven it? The molten image and the teacher of lies, that the maker of his work trusteth therein to make dumb idols. Woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, and to the dumb stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And I was, sorry. He'll probably do a better job than I'm doing. But we create an image, a graven image, when we limit God to merely an equation where he has to make up. That's a graven image. And it may be not the graven image that we think of wood and stone, but it's not the God that we serve, and it's not the God who sits on the throne. And here at the end of Habakkuk, God could say, let all the earth keep silence before him. And which leads me to the conclusion, and I don't always remember it, but when I do, it's powerful. I would rather trust a God I can't fully understand than fully understand a God I can't trust. I would rather trust a God I can't fully understand than fully understand a God I can't trust. And that comes from a place of humility to realize I don't know everything, and there may be reasons for what I'm going through that I just can't see. So Naaman's first error was to see his suffering as merely an interruption on an honorable, valiant life. His second error was saying, I thought you were going to do something miraculous to make up for it. Let's keep reading. Verse 12. It says, Arna, Arbana. Okay, so he says, I thought the Lord was going to come out and strike his hand over the place and recover the leper. Verse 12, Arna, Arbana, and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned away and went in a rage. And his servants came near and spake unto him and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldst thou have not done it? How much rather then, when he saith to thee, Wash and be clean? Then he went down and dipped himself 7 times into the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. Our third error in our understanding of suffering, in our understanding of the leprosy that invades our life, is that we underappreciate the suffering of Christ. And I know I do. Naaman thought that the Lord of all the earth is truly found in beautiful things, right? So he expected God to work through the beauty of Arbana and Pharpar. Can't I go wash in them? Why do I have to go wash in a filthy river? And when I put myself into the story, it's like having an affliction of my skin and being told to go wash in the Naugatuck River. Like think about 30 years ago, perhaps, I'll say. He's being asked to walk into a river that he sees as unclean. It doesn't make sense. And a lot of times our suffering, we can respond in the same way. It doesn't make sense. Our leprosy can sometimes cause 2 opposite effects, and I see this in my own life. When I'm upset about something that I feel like I have no control over and that's come into my life, I can either turn to self-pity or become self-important. So I can either become very woeful about my situation and begin to pity myself and act accordingly, or I become prideful. We kind of spoke about that in Sunday school this morning, that sometimes when my back is against the wall, I become prideful as a defense mechanism. But the writer of Proverbs 30 says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me, lest I be full and deny thee and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and take the name of my God in vain." We tend, when we're confronted by suffering, to turn inward and retreat. And if our leprosy is something that brings us shame, we might withdraw from the people that we love and who love us the most. But rather than turn inward, I want to share some of the shame and suffering that Christ experienced at Calvary. I'm going to read some passages. Mark 14:50, as the soldiers came to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him, it said, they all forsook him and fled. All his friends left him. In fact, one was so scared of what was going on that it said he ran through the forest naked. He was so afraid that he couldn't even gather his clothes. They all forsook him and fled. He stood alone. John 19:16, then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him and whipped him. And the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they smote him with their hands. And Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto them, "Behold, I bring forth to you that ye may know that I find no fault in him." Then came Jesus forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate saith unto them, "Behold the man." And when the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate saith unto them, "Take ye him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Completely humiliated. Completely humiliated. And finally, the last passage I'll read to you from Matthew 27 says, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And there's rich depths in that phrase, which we will never fully understand. But in this moment, he could be being fully separated from his Father, from the one he had known from the beginning of time, for my sake, to endure the humiliation, the shame, and the purple robe. I should be standing up here in a purple robe and a plaited crown of thorns for my sin and my rebellion against God. I should be being whipped and barely able to stand on my feet for my sin. But I'm not. But one stood in my place. And the problem that our leprosy and our suffering in our life can do is it makes me feel like we stand alone. It could overwhelm us with shame such that we withdraw. And I want you to remember that someone already stood in that place of shame on your behalf and bore what you could not. And that person is your Creator, the very Lord Jesus. And I want to read the end of the verse that we left off on, verse 14. It says, he dipped himself in the Jordan, and when he came out, his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And if I picture this story, and I picture him getting into the water. I'm actually kind of a mild hypochondriac, so getting in dirty waters would freak me out. But the fact that I picture the first dip being really gross and cold, the second and third, and then you're already goopy and slimy, and the seventh one coming out of the water and realizing the pain in your hands are gone. Because he was a leper, he probably felt the cold water on his fingertips for the first time. And his flesh, it said, was as a little child. And I picture him running out to the shore and dancing with his friends. And you know how awkward it is to run when you're trying to run out of water. But he couldn't get there fast enough to celebrate with his friends. He was healed. He was healed by what the Lord had prescribed. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel. But I want to say, this is not an assurance that your leprosy will be healed in this life. That this story, although it's beautiful and encouraging, it might be an affliction that you're afflicted with through the end of your days. So my encouragement is not to hope for it to be lifted, but it's to find kinship in the man of sorrows when you're going through it. Because that is the only assurance I can give you, is that someone stood there in your place and endured it far greater than we ever have to. For me and for you. I cannot guarantee you to be healed this side of heaven, but I can guarantee you that there is one standing there ready to accept you in kinship. Let's keep reading as we close in our last passage, verse 15. It says, and he returned to the man of God, Naaman. Naaman returned to the man of God, Elisha, and he and all his company and came and stood before him, and he said, behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now, therefore, I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. If you recall, he had a tremendous gift. It was probably took many chariots to get there. This tremendous offering to give to Elisha for his healing. Verse 16, but he said, Elisha, as the Lord liveth before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And I want to pause there for a moment and think about the magnitude of what he's rejecting. Before Elisha is likely the shimmering gold of all these raiments and these precious metals that he had brought as a gift. And Elisha could say, I will take none of it. I will take none of it. Elisha must see something that we cannot. And I believe he does, because in the very next chapter, when the Syrian army comes back and surrounds Israel, Elisha, I'll read it to you. Elisha had a servant next to him, and they are looking at all the army encompassing the camp to hurt them. 2 Kings chapter 6, you don't need to turn there. It says, when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto them, alas, my master, what shall we do? How shall we do? And Elisha answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. There is more to life than what we can merely see. There is a spiritual realm of which we know very little, but knows a lot about us. And it's seeking in many ways to turn us away from God through whatever means. Just look at the story of Job. There's more to life than what we can merely see. And you know what happens is whatever we identify as our leprosy, our suffering in our life, our interruption, has a unique way of narrowing our vision so that we see even less and less. I know in my own life, when I'm struck by something that I wasn't expecting, I can become very narrow-visioned. But here we see that Elisha, even though the riches of the world and the easy way to receive this gift and probably be set for life was right before him, he said, I will receive none. There's something greater than what this world has to offer. And it's this spirit and this heart of Elisha that leads Naaman to say, now I know. Now I know that there's no other God, that the Lord is one. Our leprosy, whatever you may have identified it in your life, our leprosy is crushing. Like thickened nerves, it squeezes out our ability to feel the love and grace of God, just like a leper can't feel his fingertips or toes. When we are struggling with leprosy, it squeezes out our ability to feel that precious warmth and love of God. But we are not without hope, because it was Naaman's very shame and pain that brought him to this point of salvation, of understanding that God was the only God. So where does that leave us? If we can correct these 4 errors, or if we move to understand them a bit better and look to act in a different way, to reframe our thinking, it may not relieve us of our suffering, but it might restore our spirit. And it's the following. Don't merely see your leprosy as an interruption in your life. No, don't merely see it as an interruption. Unfortunately, suffering is an expected part of the human experience. So see where the opportunities lie within it, which doesn't come right away. I'm not going to pretend it comes right away. But the heart of the Bible seeks us to be refined by our suffering. How do we do that? Well, there's 2 ways that we saw. It's to pursue a clear conscience, always. Pursue righteousness. Seek to be like Christ in all our doings. And secondly, is to have an intentional awareness of God's presence, even when you can't see him. Trust he's there. Even when it feels like your prayers are just hitting the ceiling, as I've heard it said, trust that he is listening. Have an intentional awareness of God's presence. Number 2, stop trying to justify God's actions. When I stopped trying to see God come in as I expected him to, to balance the equation that always seemed slightly off. I found freedom just like Elizabeth Elliot. I found freedom through her words, that I'm not the only one who struggles with that, with trying to figure out why God is acting in a certain way. But when we free ourselves like Habakkuk, we no longer reduce God to a graven image that we fully understand, but to a God who we don't understand, but who loves us deeply and stood at the cross. And that leads us to our third, is to seek a deeper understanding of what Christ truly endured at Calvary. Seek a deeper understanding of the true depth of Christ's suffering at Calvary, and remember that it was on your behalf. And finally, remember the eternal perspective, that there is far more to this life than what we can see, and that your suffering, although it may be hard to see why it has any purpose, that there is a God and a spiritual realm of which surrounds us. We are not without hope. And my prayer is that by doing so, you can be like Naaman and say, now I know. I'll close in prayer. Father, I thank you for this story of Naaman and your grace in healing him. I pray that we would all reflect on what it is in our life that's squeezing out our ability to feel your grace and goodness, what we stand in shame with that causes it to be hard to approach you or to feel your grace in our life. And I pray that, Lord, if you don't remove it, you didn't remove Paul's suffering, whatever it was, the thorn in his flesh, he prayed for it fervently and you didn't remove it, but your power was made perfect in his weakness. And I pray the same for us. That we, if you don't bring healing, that we would find kinship in the man of sorrows who gave it all that we might live. And I pray for anyone in this room who doesn't know the work of Calvary in a personal way, that Jesus died, bled and died, and rose again, victorious over our sin and shame, that all of our sin and shame was nailed firmly to the cross, as Colossians tells us. Everything written against us, every ordinance that was against us was nailed to the cross, that we would find hope and encouragement at Calvary and continue to move forward in our life. We thank you for this day. I thank you for this church. I thank you for my parents-in-laws. And I pray, God, that you would bless the rest of the day to follow. And in Jesus'